Eduardo Paolozzi is a key figure in Pallant House Gallery's collection. He was a great friend of Colin St. John Wilson, who was known as Sandy Wilson, who was the architect of the gallery's new wing. And indeed, Colin St. John Wilson and his wife, MJ Long, formed one of the largest private collections of Paolozzi's work, much of which has since been given to the gallery, first of all in 2006 and later in 2022. Now, Paolozzi was Scottish by birth. He was born in Edinburgh, but in fact, his family, as his name suggests, was from Italy. His father had a shop, and the shop sold sweets and ice creams. And in fact, Paolozzi as a child collected things like cigarette cards and sweet wrappers. And that interest in the kind of detritus of everyday life formed absolutely the kind of heart of his work. Throughout his life, collage was at the center of what he did in terms of works on paper, in terms of prints, in terms of fabrics and sculptures. We have here next to us one of his sculptures from the 1950s, a standing figure. And when you look at its surface, of course, it's this kind of mottled surface. It's actually a bronze sculpture. But of course, you can see all kinds of different forms that he's used here. Little bits of machine parts, clock workings. There's a wheel from a child's toy. Paolozzi wrote about his technique of casting sculptures, and he said, "I began with clay rolled out on the table. Into the clay I pressed pieces of metal, toys, etc. I also sometimes scored the clay. From there I proceeded in one of two ways. Either I would pour wax directly onto the clay to get a sheet, or I would pour plaster onto the clay. With the plaster, I then had a positive and negative form on which to pour the wax. The wax sheets were pressed around forms, cut up and added to forms or turned into shapes on their own. The waxes were cast into bronze at Fiorini and Carney in London." And so you really can get a sense of that with the surface of this, how using the lost wax technique, it's then been cast in bronze, so you get this very kind of dark figure. And of course these figures, these robotic figures, have a lot of connection with Paolozzi's wider interest in science fiction in the 1940s. And we have quite a lot of prints in the collection which connect to his interest in things like space travel, UFOs, things like this. And of course, the mechanized human body. And he had a lot of interest to do with man and machine and motion and these ideas of robots in the 1950s. It also, of course, connects with the work of artists such as Alberto Giacometti, his single standing figures. And you can see how sculptures like this really connect us to existentialism in post-war Paris. And Paolozzi, after he studied at the Slade, had gone to Paris, and there he'd visited, for example, Giacometti and other artists. And so there's a real connection in his work between what was happening internationally and also what he brought home to London at that time.